It was an ordinary morning. Evelyn Harper was making her coffee when the phone rang. A man asked for her husband. She answered simply, "He passed away 3 months ago." There was a pause, longer than it should have been. Then the man said, almost to himself, "That's strange. He never misses Tuesday." The words stayed with her. Not the call, not the man, just Tuesday. What was Tuesday? And where had he been going, week after week, without ever saying a word? What she would find in a quiet room in Millbrook would uncover a life no one around her had ever seen. And the truth her husband left behind might just change the way you see love, loss, and what it really means to show up. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And if this story feels familiar in any way, stay with me. The morning came quietly over Fairview, Vermont, a thin frost settling across the yard, while bare maple branches stretched against a pale, colorless sky. Inside the house, the air carried that familiar early chill of late autumn, the kind that lingered in old walls before the heat had time to catch up. Evelyn Harper stood at the kitchen counter, one hand resting lightly against the worn wooden edge as she waited for the kettle to warm. At 72, she had become a woman of quiet routines. She measured coffee the same way her husband once did, 2 careful scoops, leveled without thinking, though she now brewed only enough for 1 cup. She folded the dish towel along its seams. She opened the blinds halfway, never more, because Daniel had always said morning light should enter gently. 3 months had passed since his death. Grief had not lessened. It had only changed shape. It lived in the empty chair across the table, in the second mug she no longer reached for, in the way she still turned slightly when she spoke, as if someone might answer. It no longer announced itself loudly. It had become something quieter, more patient. The kettle began to hum. Evelyn glanced toward the small clock mounted above the doorway. Daniel had insisted on keeping that clock even after it started running a few seconds slow. Every Tuesday morning, before he left, he would tap the glass once, adjust it slightly, and say, almost to himself, "Still right." She had teased him about it once, years ago. He had smiled, but never stopped. The phone rang just after 8. It startled her, not because it was loud, but because it felt out of place. Most people no longer called. Messages were easier, quieter, less demanding. She let it ring twice, then picked it up, wiping her hand against her cardigan as if answering required preparation. "Hello?" A man's voice came through, low, steady, unfamiliar. "Is Daniel there?" Evelyn's gaze shifted automatically to the chair across from her. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "He passed away 3 months ago." Silence followed. Not brief, not uncertain. A silence that lingered just long enough to feel deliberate. "Oh," the man said. Evelyn waited for the rest, for the apology, the soft change in tone people used when they realized they had stepped into someone's grief. Instead, what came next felt misplaced. "That's strange." Evelyn straightened slightly. "Excuse me?" "I called yesterday," the man said, "and the week before that, no answer." Another pause. "He never misses Tuesday." The words were simple, almost casual, but they stayed. Evelyn tightened her grip on the receiver. "Who is this?" "Thomas. Thomas Reed." The name settled slowly into place. She knew him, not well, but enough to recognize the shape of him in her memory. Thomas Reed had always been part of Daniel's life in a quiet, peripheral way. A tall man with a slightly stooped posture that came from years of physical work, his face weathered and lined, gray hair cut short, a faint stubble that softened the sharper edges of his jaw. He was not unfriendly, just reserved. The kind of man who spoke only when necessary and meant what he said. Evelyn had met him a handful of times, once on the porch when Daniel introduced him without much detail, once at a small gathering years ago where Thomas had stood near the edge of the room, observing more than speaking. There had always been something steady about him, grounded. "Yes," she said slowly. "I remember." "I'm sorry, Evelyn. I didn't know." "No," she replied. "I suppose you wouldn't." Behind her, the kettle began to hiss softly, but she did not move. Thomas exhaled faintly. "Daniel told us not to call." Evelyn frowned. "Not to call?" "If he ever missed a few weeks," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "He said he'd come back when he could." The sentence felt familiar. Daniel had always been that kind of man, direct, practical, uninterested in explaining more than necessary. If something made sense to him, he rarely felt the need to justify it further. Thomas paused. "But it's been 3 months." That was different. Evelyn sat down slowly, the chair beneath her giving its usual soft creak. "Where was he supposed to be?" Another silence. "That's not something I can explain well over the phone," Thomas said. Evelyn felt something shift. Not panic, not yet, but something she couldn't ignore. A quiet disturbance, like a thought that refused to settle. "Thomas," she said, more carefully now, "my husband is gone. If there's something I should know—" "There is," he said gently, "but you need to see it." The kettle whistled sharply, breaking the stillness. Evelyn reached out and turned off the stove without taking the phone from her ear. "There's a storage building in Millbrook," Thomas continued. "Garrison Road. Come next Tuesday, around 9. "A storage building?" she repeated, the words sounding foreign. "Yes." "What's there?" Thomas hesitated, then answered in a way that felt both clear and incomplete. "A part of Daniel's life you haven't seen." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. Daniel Harper had been a man of order. 75 when he died, with silver hair combed neatly back and a trimmed gray beard that gave him a quiet dignity. His face carried a calm steadiness that made people trust him without knowing why. He had worked as an accountant for decades, and even in retirement, that structure remained. He paid bills early. He kept notes in small, tidy handwriting. He never left things unfinished. And every Tuesday morning, without fail, he left the house at nearly the same time. Sometimes in his brown coat, sometimes in that old blue flannel shirt he refused to throw away. He would check the kitchen clock before leaving, tap it once, then glance toward her with a small nod. "I'll be in Milbrook," he would say, or simply, "meeting Thomas." It had never sounded like something that needed explanation. After 46 years of marriage, Evelyn had stopped asking. "What happened there?" she asked quietly. "Come and see," Thomas replied. When the call ended, Evelyn remained seated, the phone still in her hand. The kitchen had not changed. The same table, the same chair, the same quiet. And yet something no longer fit. She poured her coffee and sat across from the empty chair. Tuesday. The word lingered. She tried to dismiss it, told herself it was nothing, that Daniel had simply been helping Thomas with something routine. That grief was making her search for meaning where there was none. But the thought stayed. That night, she lay in bed staring into the dimness, the ceiling faintly outlined by the streetlight outside. For months, her thoughts had circled the same loss, the same absence. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what had been there all along and never shared. By morning, the decision had already settled quietly inside her. Next Tuesday, she would go to Milbrook. Not because she was ready, but because she could no longer pretend she didn't need to know. And somewhere beneath that decision was a quieter truth she had not yet fully accepted. Whatever she found there would not bring Daniel back. It would only show her a man she had not completely known. The morning after the call did not feel different at first. The light came through the same half-open blinds, soft and careful, just the way Daniel had always preferred. Evelyn moved through the kitchen slowly, her hands following routines that no longer required thought. But something had shifted. Not in the room, not in the air, but in the way she noticed things. The house was no longer just quiet. It felt incomplete in a way she had not recognized before. She did not go to Milbrook that day. It was Wednesday. There were still 6 days between her and whatever waited there. But time no longer moved evenly. It stretched around certain thoughts, tightened around others. And without trying, her mind kept returning to one word. Tuesday. Daniel had always left on Tuesdays. Not occasionally. Not when it was convenient. Always. Evelyn stood at the sink, rinsing a cup that had already been clean. She tried to remember when she had stopped asking questions. In the early years, she had asked without hesitation. "Where are you going? Do you need anything?" And Daniel had always answered in the same steady way. "Just meeting Thomas." Or sometimes, "I'll be back before dinner." Nothing in his tone had ever suggested distance. Nothing had ever asked to be questioned further. So she stopped asking. Not because she didn't care, but because everything about it had felt consistent. And consistency, over time, begins to look like truth. Evelyn dried her hands slowly and leaned against the counter. Through the window, she could see the edge of the gravel driveway where Daniel used to park. Every Tuesday morning, he would step out with that same unhurried motion, close the door gently, and adjust his coat, as if preparing himself for something structured, something expected. He was not a man who drifted into things. He showed up. Always. He never misses Tuesday. The sentence returned again, heavier now. Evelyn moved into the living room and sat in the chair by the window, the one Daniel rarely used. Her hands rested quietly in her lap as she tried to hold on to something more than fragments. Thomas Reed. She let the name settle again, this time with more attention. He had always seemed like a man who carried more than he said. Tall, slightly bent at the shoulders, his movements careful but deliberate. His voice had a low steadiness to it. Not warm, but not distant either. The kind of voice that did not rush to fill silence. She remembered a night, years ago, when Daniel had stepped out of the room and left them alone for a moment. Thomas had been standing near the bookshelf, his hands loosely at his sides. "You've known him a long time?" she had asked. Thomas had nodded. "Long enough." Then, after a pause, he added, "He doesn't forget people." At the time, she had thought it was just a compliment. Now it felt like something else. Evelyn looked around the room. There was no sign of anything hidden. no evidence of another life. And yet, the precision of those Tuesdays suggested something more than habit. It had never changed. Not once. She stood slowly and walked toward the hallway. There was a cabinet near Daniel's study where he kept his notebooks. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it. Inside were several thin notebooks, all worn in the same quiet way. She picked one at random and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with numbers, dates, short notes written in his familiar handwriting. Nothing unusual. Until she reached a page folded slightly at the corner. Evelyn paused. Then she unfolded it. There was no title, no explanation, just a list of names. First names. Beside each one, a short note. Sometimes a number. Sometimes a single word. Her eyes moved slowly down the page. Most of the names meant nothing to her, until one of them did. Lucas. There was something about the way it was written, slightly darker, as if Daniel had pressed the pen harder. Next to it, a small notation she couldn't immediately understand. Evelyn felt a faint tightening in her chest. She did not read further, not because she was afraid of what she might find, but because she understood something, suddenly and clearly. This was not a secret meant to be uncovered all at once. It was something that had been built over time. And Tuesday was part of it. She closed the notebook gently and returned it to its place, aligning it exactly as it had been before. The cabinet door closed with a soft, final sound. For the rest of the day, she followed her usual routine. But each movement carried a different weight. Each quiet moment seemed to hold a question she could not yet answer. That night, she sat in the living room without turning on the television. The house felt still, but not empty in the same way as before. There was something else now. Something waiting. Names. A pattern. A day that had never been missed. Evelyn leaned back slightly, her eyes resting on the dim reflection in the window. For years, she had believed she understood the shape of her life. Now, she was beginning to see something else. It wasn't that Daniel had hidden something from her. It was that he had carried something, without ever needing to explain it. And somehow, that made it feel even more important. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Next Tuesday was no longer just a day. It was an answer waiting to be seen. Tuesday arrived without announcement. The sky over Fairview looked no different from any other morning, pale and steady, the kind of light that did not demand attention. But Evelyn Harper moved through it with a quiet awareness that made each step feel deliberate. She did not rush. At her age, rushing had long ago been replaced by something else. Precision. And this morning, precision felt necessary. The drive to Milbrook was familiar in distance, but not in feeling. The road seemed narrower, the turns arriving sooner than expected. Evelyn kept both hands on the wheel, her posture upright, her gaze steady. She passed small houses, closed storefronts, a gas station she barely remembered noticing before. Nothing had changed. And yet everything felt slightly out of place. Garrison Road appeared almost without warning. The storage facility sat back from the road, quiet and unremarkable. Rows of metal doors, faded at the edges, stretched in both directions. The kind of place people used to keep things they did not need every day, but could not throw away. Evelyn stepped out of the car and closed the door gently behind her. The air carried a sharper chill here, or perhaps she simply noticed it more. She stood still for a moment, her eyes adjusting not to the light, but to the weight of the decision that had already been made before she arrived. Then she walked forward. Inside, the hallway was longer than it looked from the outside. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting an even, colorless glow. The floor echoed faintly beneath her steps. She followed the numbers until she reached the door Thomas had described. She lifted her hand and knocked. The sound landed cleanly, without hesitation. The door opened almost immediately. Thomas Reed stood there, one hand still on the handle. Up close, the details of him were clearer than before. The lines around his eyes were deeper, not from age alone, but from years of watching more than speaking. His shoulders leaned slightly forward, as if accustomed to carrying weight that did not always belong to him. His gaze met hers, not searching, not questioning, simply present. "Evelyn," he said. She nodded once. He stepped aside. That was all the invitation she needed. The room beyond was not hidden. It was working. A long table stretched across the center, covered with files arranged in careful stacks. Two smaller desks stood along the walls, each occupied. Papers moved, but not chaotically. Every motion had direction. Every pause had purpose. No one asked who she was, but everyone noticed. At the far end sat a woman in her late 50s, tall, narrow-shouldered, her posture straight despite the hours she must have spent in that chair. Her short silver-blonde hair framed a face marked by quiet concentration. Thin glasses rested low on her nose as she wrote, her pen moving steadily, without interruption. There was nothing hurried about her, but nothing wasted either. "That's Margaret," Thomas said quietly. "She used to be a caseworker." Margaret looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Evelyn's for just a second. It wasn't a greeting. It was recognition. Of presence, not identity. Then she returned to her work. To the right, a man in his early 40s leaned over a stack of folders. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with faint scars that spoke of physical work long before this room. His dark hair fell forward slightly as he read, pushing it back absently with one hand. There was tension in him, but not restlessness. Focus. "He's here because of Daniel," Thomas added. "Years ago." The man glanced up, held Evelyn's gaze just long enough to acknowledge her, then nodded once before returning to the file in front of him. No introductions followed. They were not needed. Evelyn stepped closer to the table. The files were arranged in layers, some complete, others waiting. Dates marked their edges, notes written in different hands, some neat, some rushed. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the top folder. Then she moved it aside, another beneath it. And then she saw the name, Lucas. The file was thinner than the others, not neglected, but unresolved, as if it had been picked up, set down, and picked up again. Evelyn slid it free. Inside, the first page held a photograph. A boy. 7 years old. His hair was uneven, cut without care. The sleeves of his shirt hung slightly past his wrists, as if it belonged to someone else before him. His hands rested on his knees, still, controlled. His eyes looked toward the camera, but not fully into it. He was not afraid. He was waiting. Evelyn felt her breath slow. She turned the page. Short notes, dates, a placement that had not lasted, a line marked once, firmly. Time-sensitive, no resolution followed, only space. She did not read further. She didn't need to. The room continued around her, papers shifting, quiet voices exchanging brief words. But no one reached for the file in her hands. Evelyn looked up. Thomas was watching. Not closely, not urgently, but with an understanding that did not need to be explained. "He hasn't been taken," he said. Evelyn frowned slightly. "Taken?" "We do what we can," Thomas replied. "Not everything." There was no apology in it, only limit. Evelyn looked back down at the file. Lucas, 7 years old. Waiting. The word settled somewhere deeper this time. She closed the folder slowly. Her hand remained on it for a moment longer than necessary. Then she spoke. "I'll take this one." The room did not stop, but something in it shifted. Margaret's pen paused, only for a breath, before continuing. The man at the desk looked up again, this time holding her gaze a fraction longer. Then he nodded. Thomas did not speak, but his shoulders just slightly eased. Evelyn placed the file on the table in front of her. Not gently, not carefully, but firmly, as if placing it somewhere meant it could not be ignored. For the first time since she stepped into the building, she understood something clearly. This had never been about finding answers. It had been about continuing something that had never been meant to stop. Evelyn lifted her hand from the file. And this time, Tuesday did not feel like a question anymore. It felt like something she had chosen. No one paused to acknowledge Evelyn's decision. The room did not change its rhythm, and that, more than anything, told her she had not interrupted something. She had stepped into it. Margaret was already reaching for another file, her pen moving again with quiet precision. The younger man had returned to his desk, flipping through pages as if time itself were something that could slip, if not held firmly enough. Thomas remained near the table, his presence steady, not guiding, not directing, simply there. "This isn't a place people stay," he said after a moment, his voice low enough that it didn't travel beyond the space between them. "Not most days." Evelyn rested her hand lightly on Lucas's file again, feeling the faint texture of the paper beneath her fingertips. "Then how does it work?" she asked. Thomas glanced briefly toward the others before answering. "Everyone here has something else. Jobs, lives, responsibilities that don't wait." He shifted his weight slightly, his hands settling against the back of a chair. "But Tuesday is when it all comes back together." Evelyn followed his gaze. Margaret had opened another file now, scanning quickly before marking something along the margin. There was no hesitation in her movement. Whatever decision she made, it was made with the certainty of someone who had done it many times before. "We don't take everything," Thomas continued. "We can't." His tone remained even, not defensive, not apologetic. "So we look for what can still change if we move in time." The younger man at the desk spoke without looking up. "If it's already broken beyond reach, we don't pretend we can fix it." His voice carried a quiet roughness, shaped more by experience than by emotion. He turned a page, then added, "But if there's a window, even a small one, we take it." Evelyn nodded slowly. Her eyes returned to Lucas's file. A window. That was what she had seen in it, though she hadn't named it yet. "And what happens next?" she asked. Margaret answered this time. She set her pen down and turned slightly in her chair, her movements controlled, but unforced. "Next is verification," she said. "We don't act on assumption." She gestured lightly toward the folder. "Names, locations, current status. We confirm everything before we move." Evelyn listened carefully, absorbing not just the words, but the rhythm behind them. This wasn't a system built on urgency alone. It was built on discipline. "And after that?" Evelyn asked. "Then we move fast," Margaret replied. "Calls, contacts, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's placement, sometimes it's just making sure someone doesn't disappear between 1 week and the next." She paused, then added, "Every case is different. The rule isn't what we do. The rule is that we don't wait once we know." Evelyn felt something settle into place. It wasn't complicated. That was what made it difficult to ignore. Thomas nodded once. Daniel understood that better than anyone. There was no need to say more. The weight of that sentence carried its own meaning. Evelyn glanced around the room again. No one here looked like they were saving lives. No uniforms, no titles, no recognition. And yet everything about the way they worked suggested something precise, something intentional, something that mattered even if no one outside this room ever knew it existed. Her hand remained on Lucas's file. "Who starts it?" she asked quietly. Thomas looked at her, not surprised by the question. "The one who takes it." Evelyn drew a slow breath. That answer did not leave space for hesitation. Margaret stood, stepping closer to the table. Up close, the lines on her face were more visible. Not signs of age alone, but of years spent making decisions that did not always have clear outcomes. She placed one hand lightly beside the file. "We'll help you," she said. "But you lead." Evelyn nodded once. The younger man pushed his chair back slightly, turning toward them. "I'll pull the contact list," he said. "If there's anything current, it'll be there." Margaret gave a small acknowledgement and reached for a separate stack of notes. Thomas stepped back, not leaving, but giving space. The movement in the room shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to change its direction. Where there had been general motion before, there was now focus. On one file, on one name. Lucas. Evelyn opened the folder again, this time not as someone discovering it, but as someone responsible for what came next. The photograph was still there, unchanged. The same stillness in the boy's posture, the same quiet waiting in his eyes. But it did not feel the same. Not anymore. Because this time, he was no longer waiting alone. Evelyn looked at the notes more carefully. Dates. A placement that had already failed. A line referencing a temporary arrangement that had not held. Each detail was small on its own. But together, they formed something fragile. Something that could still shift, if it was reached in time. "We start today," she said. Margaret nodded. "We start now." The younger man was already moving, pulling a worn binder from a shelf and flipping through its pages with practiced speed. Thomas remained near the edge of the table, watching without interfering. There was no formal signal, no moment that marked the beginning. Only movement. Evelyn felt it then, not as pressure, not as fear, but as something quieter and steadier. A sense that this work did not begin when someone decided to help. It began when someone chose not to wait. She closed the folder again, this time with intention. For years, Tuesday had been a day she never questioned. Now, it was a day that required something from her. And for the first time, she understood why Daniel had never missed it. Work did not stop after the decision was made. It simply shifted. Margaret moved through her calls with quiet precision, confirming names, placements, and details that had to be right the first time. Daniel Ortiz sat across from her, flipping through a worn binder filled with years of handwritten notes, his fingers moving quickly but never carelessly. Thomas remained near the table, watching not the people, but the rhythm they created together. Evelyn stayed seated, Lucas's file open in front of her. The photograph no longer felt like something she had found. It felt like something that had found her. Winter cases tend to stay longer, Margaret said, her voice calm as she listened to someone on the other end of the line. People assume they're already being handled. She wrote something down, then added, "Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't." Evelyn turned the page again, slower now. The notes did not tell a story, but they pointed to one. Temporary placement. Unstable contact. A line marked with quiet urgency. Winter intake. Thomas stepped closer, resting one hand on the back of a chair. "Daniel used to watch winter," he said. "Not the weather. The cases." Evelyn looked up. "Why winter?" Thomas took a moment before answering. "Because that's when people disappear," he said. "Not all at once, slowly, quietly. One missed call, one placement that doesn't hold." He glanced at the file. "If no one steps in, they don't come back." The room continued to move, but Evelyn felt everything narrow to a single line of thought. "Was he one of them?" she asked. Thomas nodded once. 8 years old, he said, cold enough that it stayed with him. He pulled a chair slightly closer, not sitting fully, but leaning into the memory. There was no plan for him, no place that was meant to last. Then a family took him in, not through the system, not officially. His voice softened, not with emotion, but with care. They just opened the door. Evelyn did not speak. "No paperwork, no promise," Thomas continued. "Just a place to stay until the winter passed." "And after?" Evelyn asked. Thomas shook his head. "He didn't stay," he said. "But he stayed long enough." The words settled deeper than their simplicity suggested. "Long enough for what?" Evelyn asked. Thomas met her eyes this time. "Long enough to know what it felt like not to be left outside." Daniel Ortiz paused briefly at the binder, his hand resting on the page before turning it. He did not look up, but the stillness in his movement said enough. Evelyn closed the file halfway, her hand still resting on it. "That's why he did this," she said. Thomas nodded. "Not to fix everything," he replied, "just to make sure it didn't stop happening." Margaret ended her call and turned slightly toward them. "Consistency is what changes outcomes," she said, "not scale." Evelyn opened the file again. The photograph had not changed, but something inside her had. "What's his current placement?" she asked. Daniel Ortiz answered this time. "Temporary foster, not stable." He flipped a page. "School flagged attendance. That usually means transition." "Or drift," Margaret added quietly. Evelyn felt the word settle. "Can we reach them?" she asked. Margaret was already dialing. The call rang longer than the others. When someone answered, Margaret's voice remained steady, but softer. She confirmed details, repeated names, asked only what needed to be asked. When she ended the call, she looked at Evelyn. "He's still there," she said. "For now." For now. That was all they had. Evelyn closed the file, this time with certainty. "Then we go," she said. Thomas studied her for a moment. "We move carefully," he said. Evelyn met his gaze. "We move now." There was no tension in the room, no argument, only adjustment. Daniel Ortiz stood first. "I'll drive," he said. Margaret gathered a thin stack of notes. We'll confirm on the way. Thomas stepped back, giving space, then moved toward the door. Evelyn stood last. She held the file close, not tightly, but with intention. For years, she had lived beside a story she never questioned. Now, she was stepping into one that could not wait. As they moved toward the door, the room behind them did not empty. Another file had already been opened. Another name placed on the table. Tuesday continued. But this time, Evelyn moved with it. And somewhere beyond the edge of that quiet room, a boy who had learned to wait through winter was about to be seen. The house in Fairview had not changed when Evelyn returned, but something inside it no longer settled the way it used to. The kitchen light still cast its soft yellow glow across the worn wooden table, the same chair still empty on the opposite side. For months, that emptiness had been something she lived beside. Quiet, familiar, almost expected. But tonight, it felt interrupted. She set her coat down carefully and stood still for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the back of the chair. The clock above the doorway ticked steadily, its rhythm unchanged, but it no longer felt like something she followed. Tuesday had not ended. It had followed her home. Evelyn moved through the kitchen slowly, preparing tea she would not drink. The kettle hummed, then quieted. She poured the water and sat, her hands wrapped around the cup as the heat faded. Across from her, the empty chair remained, but she did not look at it. Not tonight. Her thoughts had moved somewhere else. Lucas. The name did not press itself forward. It stayed, quiet, steady, unfinished. The kind of thought that does not leave because it has not yet been answered. She leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for a brief moment, then opening them again. The photograph returned. A boy, 7 years old, still, waiting. There had been no fear in his expression, no urgency, only patience, the kind that did not belong to a child, but to someone who had already learned what waiting meant. Evelyn stood and moved into the living room, turning off the kitchen light behind her. Darkness settled gently through the house, broken only by the dim glow of a street lamp outside. She lowered herself into the chair near the window, the one Daniel rarely used, and looked out. Nothing moved, but something had changed. For months, her nights had followed a pattern: memory, silence, then sleep. Not because she was at peace, but because there had been nowhere else for her thoughts to go. Tonight, they did not return to the past. They stayed in the present. She rose again without deciding to, and walked toward the hallway, stopping outside Daniel's study. The door remained slightly open, just as it had been for weeks. She had not entered since he passed. Not because she could not, but because she had not needed to. Now she did. The room held the same quiet order. The desk was unchanged. The notebooks stacked neatly, their edges worn not by time, but by use. Evelyn stepped closer and opened one. The handwriting was his, precise, controlled, measured in a way that reflected the man he had always been. But the content, names, dates, short entries, did not explain itself. She turned a page, another name, another line, then another. The pattern became clearer, not in meaning, but in repetition. This had not been occasional. It had been constant. Her fingers paused on the page. For a moment, she saw the connection, not as a thought, but as something immediate. Lucas was not an exception. He was part of the same line, the same quiet record, the same work Daniel had carried, week after week, without interruption. Evelyn closed the notebook slowly, her hand resting on it for a moment longer. "He never needed to explain," she said softly, because it had never been meant to stop. She returned to the bedroom sometime after midnight, though she did not remember leaving the study. The house remained still, the same quiet holding everything in place. She lay down and stared into the darkness. Sleep did not come. But it was not restlessness that kept her awake. It was clarity. For the first time since Daniel had passed, her thoughts did not circle what had been lost. They moved toward something that remained. Something that had not ended with him. Something that was now waiting for her. Evelyn turned slightly, her gaze settling on the faint outline of the window. The first hint of morning had not yet arrived, but the darkness no longer felt heavy. It felt temporary. Lucas. The name no longer felt distant. It felt connected. By the time the first light touched the edge of the glass, Evelyn had not slept. But she was no longer tired. She sat up slowly, her hands resting in her lap. There was no hesitation left. Only direction. Tuesday had shown her where to stand. This night had shown her why. And somewhere beyond the quiet walls of that house, a boy who had learned not to ask was still waiting. But not for long. Tuesday arrived colder than the week before. The kind of morning that carried a quiet edge of something about to change. Evelyn did not linger at the door this time. She stepped outside, closed it behind her, and walked to the car with a steadiness that did not come from routine. It came from knowing where she was going. The drive to Milbrook was silent. Bare trees stretched along the roadside, their branches thin against a pale sky. The road curved the same way it always had, but this time she noticed the distance differently. Not as something to pass through, but as something that led somewhere specific. She did not turn on the radio. She did not need to. By the time she reached Garrison Road, the air had sharpened. The building appeared without announcement, unchanged, unmarked. She parked, stepped out, and walked in without pausing. Inside, the room was already moving. Margaret sat at the table, her pen gliding across paper in steady, precise strokes. Daniel Ortiz stood at the far end, turning pages with quiet efficiency, his posture slightly forward, as if always leaning into the next task. Thomas remained near the window, his tall frame slightly bent, his presence steady without needing to fill the space. No one stopped. No one asked. Because she had come on a Tuesday. Evelyn stepped further inside. Her eyes went directly to the table. The file was still there. Lucas. In the exact place it had been left, not buried, not moved, waiting, but not forgotten. Evelyn stood still, long enough to understand what that meant. No one had taken it. Because no one had claimed it. And here, that mattered. This was not neglect. It was restraint. A rule no one explained, but everyone followed. You did not take a file unless you were ready to carry it. Fully. Without pause. The room continued around her, but she did not look away. She stepped closer. Her hand hovered over the folder. She did not touch it immediately. she let the silence remain. Because now she understood it. The silence was not emptiness. It was space. Space for someone to step forward. Her fingers lowered slowly, resting against the file. A small movement, but enough. For a moment, she did not speak. Then, "Let's not leave this one for another week." Her voice was calm, measured, certain. It did not break the room. It settled into it. Everything slowed. Margaret's pen stopped mid-line. Daniel's hand paused against the binder. Thomas straightened, just slightly. No one looked surprised. Because this was not unexpected. It was the moment. Margaret lifted her gaze first. There was no question in her expression, only recognition. Daniel closed the binder slowly, his hand lingering for a moment before he stepped forward. Thomas exhaled quietly. A shift had already happened. No one needed to say it. "All right," Margaret said. Not agreement. Alignment. She slid the file toward Evelyn. "Then we move it now." Daniel stepped closer. "Placement's still active," he said. "No change." Thomas adjusted his coat. "Cold's coming back," he said. Timing. Evelyn opened the file. The photograph remained the same. Lucas. 7 years old. Still. Waiting. But something had shifted. Not in him, in her. He was no longer a question. He was the reason. "What's first?" she asked. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "We verify in person," she said. "Not by phone." Daniel nodded. "I'll get the route." Thomas looked at Evelyn, not asking, not advising, simply present. Evelyn closed the file. "We go today." No hesitation. Because this was how it worked. Not through discussion, through movement. Margaret gathered the documents. Daniel took the keys. Thomas moved toward the door. Evelyn remained for a brief moment longer, just long enough to understand what had changed. A week ago, she had stood in this room unsure of where she fit. Now, she was the one who had spoken. She picked up the file. It felt lighter, because it was no longer waiting. They moved toward the door together. No explanation. No need. The work did not ask to be understood. Only to be done. The door opened. Cold air slipped in. Quiet. Certain. Winter did not arrive all at once. It settled. And if no one noticed, it stayed. Evelyn stepped outside. The sky was pale. The air sharper now. She held the file steady in her hands. For years, she had lived beside something she never saw. Now, she was walking toward something she could not leave behind. And somewhere ahead, a boy who had learned not to ask was about to be answered. Evelyn did not mark the moment she sat in Daniel's chair. There was no pause, no acknowledgement from the room, no shift in the way anyone else moved. One moment she stood beside the table, the next she had taken the seat as if it had always been waiting for her. And the work continued. Thomas remained beside her, his posture slightly forward, his attention already on the next file. Margaret wrote with the same steady precision, her pen never hesitating longer than necessary. Daniel Ortiz flipped through the remaining cases, his movements efficient, already looking ahead. No one mentioned the change, because nothing about it needed to be said. Lucas's file did not stay long on the table after that. It moved quickly, not in haste, but with clarity. Calls were confirmed. Placement verified. A school contacted. Each step carried out with the same quiet certainty that defined everything else in that room. There was no celebration when it was done, only a small mark. A stamp pressed gently onto the paper. Completed. The file was closed and placed into a different stack. Not hidden, not forgotten, just finished. Evelyn watched the movement carefully, her hands resting lightly against the table. The name Lucas no longer waited in front of them. It had passed through, and the room did what it always did. It moved on. Another file slid forward, another decision, another life, quiet and unseen, waiting to be carried through the same process. Evelyn did not step back. She leaned forward and continued. Weeks passed without needing to be counted. Tuesday became something steady in her life. Not routine, but fixed. The drive to Milbrook no longer felt like distance. It felt like direction. The room remained unchanged, but her place within it had settled. She no longer observed. She worked. And yet, something stayed with her. It was not doubt, not uncertainty, something quieter, something unfinished. It came at the end of each Tuesday, when the files were closed and the room began to empty. Papers were stacked, chairs pushed back, coats lifted from their hooks. One by one they left. And that was it. The work ended at the door. Evelyn stood there one afternoon, her hand resting against the table, watching the last of them step out. Thomas paused briefly. "You coming?" he asked. "In a minute," she said. He nodded and left. The room fell silent. Evelyn looked at the stacks of completed files, at the empty spaces where decisions had been made. And she realized something. They carried people through the moment they needed help. But they never saw what came after. The thought did not leave her. It followed her home. It stayed. A few weeks later, she spoke. It was another Tuesday. The room moved as it always did. Evelyn waited. Not for silence, but for space. Then she said simply, "What happens after?" Margaret looked up first. "After what?" "The files," Evelyn replied. "After they're completed." Daniel glanced at Thomas, then back at her. "They move on," he said. "I know," Evelyn answered, "but we don't see it." No one spoke immediately, because she was right. Thomas leaned back slightly. "We're not meant to," he said. "Maybe," Evelyn said. She paused. Then, "But maybe we could." The room shifted. Margaret set her pen down. Daniel closed the binder. Thomas looked at her differently now, not observing, but considering. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. Evelyn rested her hands lightly on the table. "Something small," she said. "Not another system." She took a breath. "Meals," she said. "On Saturdays." No one reacted immediately. "Simple ones," she continued. "Hospitals, shelters, wherever it's needed." Daniel frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought. "That's not what we do." "I know," Evelyn said. "But it could be." Silence. Then, "All right," Margaret said. Alignment. And just like that, it began. The first Saturday was quiet, no planning beyond what was needed. Evelyn stood in her kitchen, sleeves rolled, preparing food the way she always had. Carefully, deliberately. The space no longer felt empty. Thomas arrived first. Daniel followed. Margaret came last. No one spoke about why. They simply worked. Meals were prepared, packed, delivered. No one kept count. They went where they were needed and returned. Tuesday remained the same. Saturday became something else. It became visible. One afternoon, in a small hospital cafeteria, Evelyn stood beside a table as trays were handed out. The room was filled with soft noise, voices, movement, life continuing. And there, at the far end, she saw him. Lucas. He sat upright, a tray in front of him, his hands resting quietly at the edges. His posture was different now. Not waiting. Present. Someone said something to him, and for a brief moment, he smiled. It was small, almost uncertain, but real. Evelyn did not move closer. She did not need to. She stood where she was, her hands resting lightly against the table. The work had reached him, not as a file, not as a decision, but as something that continued. By the time the trays were cleared, Lucas was no longer alone, and Evelyn, for the first time, did not feel like something had been left unfinished. Tuesday remained the day decisions were made. Saturday became the day they were seen. And the work no longer stayed inside the room. In the quiet that followed, nothing in Evelyn's life seemed to demand attention. The same house stood where it always had, holding its familiar silence. The same mornings unfolded gently, one after another, without urgency. And yet, beneath that stillness, something had softened, and something had quietly begun. She no longer measured her days by what was missing. She measured them by what could still be given. There was no moment when she decided to become someone different. No turning point marked by certainty. Only a series of small choices. Showing up on a Tuesday, staying a little longer on a Saturday, noticing the spaces where someone might still be waiting. And over time, those choices gathered into something steady, something real. Lucas's smile did not arrive with noise or celebration. It came softly, like light slipping through a window that had been closed for too long. Brief, almost uncertain, but unmistakably alive. And in that small, quiet expression, there was a truth Evelyn did not need to explain. Nothing had been wasted. Not the waiting, not the silence, not even the parts of life that had once felt unfinished. Somewhere along the way, what Daniel had carried so quietly had found its way forward. Not through grand plans or spoken promises, but through hands that continued the work without asking for recognition. And perhaps that is how grace often moves through the world. Unseen, unannounced, but always present in the moments when someone chooses to care. If there is a miracle in this story, it may not be in what was changed, but in what was continued. In the simple, human decision to remain when it would be easier to turn away. In the quiet courage to begin again, even when no one is watching. And maybe, in your own life, it begins the same way. A small kindness, a gentle word, a moment of noticing someone who has been waiting longer than they should. If this story found you at the right time, you might share where you're watching from or leave a thought below. Not as an obligation, but as a way of reminding one another that we are still here, still connected in ways we don't always see. And if you feel called to it, take a quiet moment today to rest, to reflect, or to offer a simple prayer. Not for something extraordinary, but for the strength to be present, the patience to listen, and the grace to care when it matters most. May God walk gently beside you, steady your heart in uncertain moments, and bless the quiet good you bring into the lives of others, often without even knowing it. Because sometimes, the life that changes is not the one we set out to save. It is the one that learns, quietly, how to love again.